So is asking questions really so bad? Find out in this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Now, one aspect of mental health is our relationship with others. Other people are really important in our lives, whether they're our friends, our family, our support structure. And one of the big things about our relationships in our day-to-day lives is what people think of us. And I came across a couple bits of research that brought up an interesting point about questions and the various perceptions we have or judgments we make of others who ask questions, and also a tendency of people to not ask questions because they fear that there might be some sort of social consequence. So the research that I read actually was talking about how questions can actually send a signal that we may or may not necessarily want to send, and others might make judgments. Like if we're in a room full of people and we ask a question that's perceived to be a foolish question, then we're looked down upon as the only one who's ignorant in the room. So obviously this happens a lot in our day-to-day lives, but is our questions really all that big a deal? Liz, have you noticed anything?
Well, I think culturally there can be a little bit of a discouragement towards asking questions where people don't want to have to answer questions. They'll just say, look it up in the manual or something like that. Like they'll refer you back to here's where you find the information instead of answering the person's question because they don't want them coming back and asking questions the next time.
Well, and questions, especially in the workplace, can really set you back. I was reading in the Harvard Business Review that one practicing physician, while they were doing training or their residency, this physician received a negative performance evaluation, and she thought that this evaluation was really unfair. So she asked her supervising physician for an explanation as to why the negative review of her performance. And the supervisor said, well, you just don't know as much as your peers. And when the physician asked, well, how do you know that I know less than my peers? How did you reach that conclusion? The supervisor responded and said, well, you asked more questions. And so, if you think about that, I was surprised reading that because obviously doctors should ask a lot of questions. In fact, I'm really concerned if my doctor doesn't ask me a lot of questions. So it can set you back in day-to-day life. But I think the problem goes two different ways. There's, of course, being afraid to ask questions, and there's also being worried about what others may think of you for asking the questions.
Well, as well, there's the other person's perception of the person who's asking the question. So if someone's afraid to ask questions, then they're not going to ask questions, and they might not know all the information that they need to know. And I've been in settings where the facilitator really encourages people to ask questions because questions are one way that people learn. There's some people who they learn through, talking things out. And when they put their thoughts into a question, then it helps them to get to a deeper level of learning. And the main way the facilitator did this was by anytime anyone would ask a question, they'd say, great question. So there's that positive reinforcement that people are hearing, even if they would introduce their question with, I have a silly question or I have a dumb question. The facilitator would always say, great question. And so there's this reassurance that this is a safe place to ask questions.
Well, I was taking in my undergraduate degree a human biology class, and the professor in that class always encouraged questions after a brief bit of lecture, but not only said great question, but actually specifically thanked you. Oh, thank you for that question. And so really affirming, because the class was tough. He was teaching a hard sciences course to a bunch of BA students, a bunch of social sciences students, and so it was difficult material, and so he really wanted to cut through that stigma.
Yeah. And I mean, as well, it could be just that there's a large volume of material as well that can make it hard to take in. So I can imagine for a doctor trying to take in all the various things that they have to learn, there's a lot of information there. And so the asking of questions is a way of verifying that you haven't missed something.
Now, so practically speaking, so there's a couple practical parts to this. One, obviously, we can't control how others are going to perceive us or perceive how, what is meant or what signals we send by asking questions. But what we can do is actually examine how we are judging others or how we are perceiving others for them asking questions. And so this is really practically. So there's another this article I was reading also talked about this really classic example where if you could imagine an old or they don't have to be old, but a married couple driving somewhere where they haven't been and they're lost. The man would be far less likely to ask for directions than the woman, because there's a bit of a sort of gender role aspect to that, and there's also a culture aspect of that where men and women, at least in the United States and Canada, are socialized differently, to where men put a much greater value on independence and finding things for themselves. And so very practically in relationships, and as we look to bring this to mental health, Liz, is it as easy as just giving others grace for asking questions, even if they're bad questions, or is there any other way we can really apply this, sort of destigmatize the asking questions?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on, are you the one receiving the questions or are you the one asking the questions? And I think a lot of times people can associate the asking of a lot of questions with children, because children will just ask question after question. Why? And they want to know everything, so they keep asking questions. And I can't think of any other context where someone would ask so many questions as a curious child trying to learn something. So I think if we start to view that in the positive sense of someone who is asking questions is curious, they're investigating, they're trying to learn, instead of, well, they're asking questions because they're immature.
Well, as well, I do think questions are a way to sort of soften a more direct statement. I get a critique all the time from one of my employers that when I am communicating with people who I work with and I need them to do something, I will say, when you have a moment, could you please do this? And it's me asking a question, but this because I CC my supervisor on the email just so they know that yes, this is sanctioned for me to ask. But the critique I always get is, why are you asking? Don't ask, because tell them they need to do it. If you ask them, then they can say no, or they could somehow perceive this as less important or less of a priority when really it should be a high priority. So I also think that making sure you are asking questions in a context where a question is appropriate is important as well, because you can actually make a declarative statement without asking a question. You can say, please do this, or you don't have to say, could you please do this. And so this is something I'm working on anyways.
Yeah, and I think as well, if you're the person who's asking the question of someone because you're trying to learn something, you can always introduce it as, I just want to clarify, and, try to bring it up as, here's what I think it is. I just want to make sure that I have it right. So if you think that they're going to look down on you for asking the question, it shows that you're just trying to confirm something, not that you're totally unaware of what's going on.
Well, I think as well people get suspicious, or they sort of start questioning motives if questions are asked. So if you're upfront and transparent about why you're asking the question, like there are obvious contexts like a student in a classroom, but when you're asking questions of others, giving a little bit more preface to it might actually really help cut down that initial judgment that people have. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but if you enjoy our content, please consider liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. Also, let us know in the comments if there are any strategies that you've used to reduce the judgment, or what do you think? Is asking questions a really bad sign? Does it send bad signals? Let us know. We really would like to hear. And until next time, remember that small steps can lead to big changes. We'll see you next time.